It's rare that a new lure comes into my arsenal and actually changes some of the ways that I fish. But it does happen, and it happened this year. And we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, I'm Chad LaChance, and I appreciate you guys joining us. Don't forget to find folks at Sportsman's Warehouse who make this podcast and all other Fishful Thinker media activities possible. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 142 plus stores nationwide. And don't forget to find folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado. They will take care of you for all your Toyota or Volvo needs. So here we are. We're a couple weeks from Christmas, 2 weeks to the day, in fact, from Christmas, guys. And it's getting to be that time of year where I look back at the whole season, or it has been, I should say, that time of year where I look back at the whole season, what went right, what went wrong, what stuck out at me as important or unimportant, what lures came in and out of favor or boat or whatever the case might be as far as my tackle goes, and just all the kinds of things like that. And I've spent the last several days in my shop working on tackle, as I've done whole podcasts about. I do that a lot this time of year because it gives me the most amount of time to be ready for next year. So I start going through all those Plano boxes one at a time. Which lures need what? Who needs hooks? Who needs split rings? Who needs replaced altogether? Where's the holes in my tackle? What did I use? What did I not use? Incidentally, if it's in my tackle for 2 seasons and doesn't get used, it comes out of my tackle. I don't leave stuff in the boat that I don't use on a regular basis because hauling tackle around is heavy and burns gas and robs performance, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you can take 50 pounds out of your boat, it makes a difference, and anyone that's ever had a passenger knows. So I thin stuff down every year. I look back at the last couple of years and nope, haven't used any of these. They all come out of the boat and make room for new stuff. And what I wanted to talk about on this particular podcast is new stuff, because there's really been a couple baits in the last 2 years that have made a difference, and particularly one that is huge for me, that I really, to be honest with you, got off to a really bumpy start with. Dan Spangler, you've heard me talk about him a lot on this podcast and on our television shows. He's been a guest several times on Fishful Thinker Television. I think he's been on maybe 6 episodes total, something like that. Dan's the senior hardbait development manager for Berkley, so he has a lot to do with a lot of the lures that we fish with and has for more than a decade. So I know Dan well. He's a great guy, very fishy guy, by the way, has a couple of degrees, college degrees in fisheries. I think he's got 1 degree in fisheries management or fisheries something or other, and another one in aquatic vegetation. He's a pretty smart dude when it comes to fish, but at any rate, he was really pimping a particular lure to me specifically, not to the public. He's not on that side of the equation. He's trying to get anglers to like it that fish for Berkley, and that includes me. Well, he had one that he's like, man, I'm telling you, this one's underrated, and guys aren't maybe using it how they should, and this, that, and the other, and had a bunch of hype to it, and really wanted me to try it, and he sent them to me, and I was all giddy. I was like, all right, he sent me these. It's fantastic. And I didn't catch anything with him for a while. Just the opposite I've had with a lot of lures with him. Like, for instance, the hit stick. He's the guy that led the development of the Berkley hit stick. First time I tied it on, literally the first throw, I caught a smallmouth with it. That's a good sign. The lure I'm talking about here took me like days to catch fish on. And he kept, to the point where I kept texting him going, man, what is going on here? And he would be like, no, trust me, stick with it. You got to stick with it. It's a good bait. Long story short, I'm going to cut to the chase. We're several minutes in here, and I haven't even told you yet. We're talking about the finisher, the Berkley finisher. And podcasts like this makes me wish we filmed these because I could show it to you a little easier. In fact, let me take a half step back and say, hey, if you would like me to film these for 2025, to where I can actually show you some stuff as opposed to just talking, let us know. Send me an email, chad@fishfulthinker.com. Message me on one of the social media at Fishful Thinker. But if you would be happier, if you would listen more, if you would refer it more, if you aren't a subscriber, and maybe you would if we film these, let me know, because it's something we've debated. Just in an effort to get something going, I decided to just do them audio, but if you would prefer I was video, let me know and we'll work towards that. We certainly have the resources here. It's just a matter of getting a reasonable setup together and doing it. So anyway, back to my thing, the Berkley finisher. Basically, it's a gliding jig, and the easiest way that I can describe it to you is almost something like a jig and wrap. If you're familiar with a jig and wrap, we've been around for a long time, but the jig and wrap had a bunch of inherent flaws, and the finisher addressed all of those situations and made them better. Furthermore, the flaws themselves were addressed, but so were just the nuances of how the bait behaved in the water, which could be described as not necessarily a flaw, just a change, because on any given day, how you work the bait is going to make a difference one way or the other. So the finisher was made to address forward-facing sonar, fish that we could see on forward-facing sonar, but just simply don't want to bite. And it is in the same family as the several other baits along those lines that were made for that reason. It's made to be able to throw a very long time, or long ways, I should say. It's made to sink quickly, so it's controllable. Get down to the depth your fish are at in a hurry. You can work it tip up, you can work it tip down. Obviously, those are going to affect how it behaves. But it does sink on its own, and it's got a very flat bottom to it, so it glides significantly. If you keep your line tight, it glides significantly off to one side or the other. If you slack it out completely, it spirals to the bottom, more similar to a very heavily weighted tube jig. If you just retrieve it, it just sort of hunts its way around, kind of like a crankbait with part of the bill broke, and it's kind of erratic, and then depending on how fast you're retrieving it, just winding it, it just sort of hunts back and forth. And when I say hunts, it kind of wanders maybe, or like a car with a front, steering broke. It just sort of goes where it wants. If you retrieve it too fast, it'll spin, and that's the performance limitation is the only one, and you got to retrieve it pretty fast to make it do that. But it can be fished vertical, it can be fished horizontal. It has a very realistic profile, fantastic colors, and a really good hookup percentage. So when you really start addressing it and looking at the bait, it was designed for those specific reasons, and I surmised that, wait a minute, this will work for a lot of stuff. It doesn't have to be for the bass and walleyes that it was designed for. And those are the two fishing, say, sub-disciplines that are really gravitating to forward-facing sonars: bass fishing and walleye fishing, and maybe crappie as well. And incidentally, the finisher works on all of the above very, very well. So it's available in three sizes: a 5, a 7, and a 9. Of course, those are centimeters. To give you some idea of reference, they are very heavy for their size. And again, you can throw them a long ways. So a couple of things real quick. Even the little one, the number 5, I like to throw on a medium light power. It's only 5 centimeters long. It's a small bait with a small profile. But again, it's heavy enough I can throw it, and I need to throw it on a medium light or a medium powered rod. If you're talking about the 7, it needs to be on a medium or medium heavy power rod. And if you're talking about the 9, in my opinion, it needs to be on a medium heavy rod. If you start working the number 9 on a medium rod, it's too heavy. The rod will absorb too much of the action, and it will just kind of mute down everything you're doing. You won't know what's going on with the bait, and that's not too good. So for me, that's how the rod powering goes. Furthermore, after extensive testing for a variety of species, there's no question that it's a braided line lure, in my opinion. There's no application that I found where it's better on monofilament or fluorocarbon. It is a braided line lure. So I throw it on braid depending on the size. That braid could be anywhere from 8 or 10 pound for the number 5, all the way up to 20 pound for the number 9. And incidentally, I filmed a couple of trout shows this year with it. The number 9 got me the most bites. The 7 and the 9, as a general rule, get me the most bites, particularly the 9. And it's the largest of them, obviously, but I also feel like it just has the right balance of profile. And there's 2.24 or 2.54 centimeters per inch. And so when you start talking about a 9 centimeter bait, you're talking about a bait that's 3 inches or a little more, a little less. And that to me hits a sweet spot a lot of the time. If you're a fan, you know we throw a lot of 3-inch gulp minnows, we throw a lot of 3-inch tube jigs, power minnows. There's just something about a 3-inch bait. It's not too big, not too small, just right. And many of my biggest fish, including my biggest tarpon, bit a 3-inch bait, and so that should tell you something right there. But anyway, back to my number 9 finisher. That's been the most consistent one for me, and I think it's because I can work it the most ways. I can throw it the farthest, and again, I work it on relatively heavy tackle, and that tackle allows me to land fish in a hurry, and that's something that I take pride in. And so anyway, that's my story on how I fish. I like it on fast reels, of course. These days, almost anything I throw on faster reels. There's not, the only scenario that I want a slow reel these days has come down to pure crankbaiting, something that takes cranking power, like having your truck in 4 low, and at which point I want a very low speed reel, whether it be cast reel or spinning reel, and I use the winches for that. But if it's anything else, faster is better. I throw the finisher with a Revo rocket, and that's the fastest reel I got, and it works great for that. So that's the skinny on the tackle. Typically, I've got a fluorocarbon leader. Typically, it's a very stiff fluorocarbon leader, and I will tie it with a loop knot at the end, perfection loop to go to the bait, or I will put a split ring on them, and I've done both. I prefer to go with the perfection loop and retie it relatively often, is how I most often will rig them. I will say this: if you're going to fish the bait and you want to dumb the action down, you can skip the loop knot, but the loop knot allows it to behave even more freely. So, and that's going to be important in certain scenarios of depending on how you're working the bait. If you're straight retrieving it, it probably doesn't matter. The bait will hunt around just fine. But if you're working it vertical and you want subtle action out of it, for sure the loop is going to be important. And anywhere in between the loop can be important. It allows the stiffness of the fluorocarbon to not affect the lure so much, and that's what the loop knot will do. If you cinch a nice, Palomar knot or something like that down tight against the bait, it's going to dumb the action down quite a bit. So that's where the story is there. Now, what species have I caught with the finisher? Well, the shorter answer is what species have I not caught, because I said in the beginning that I wasn't catching fish for a while with it, which means I was forcing the issue, and I was literally texting back and forth with Dan going, man, I don't know about this bait. It's really not producing fish like I really thought it was gonna. And he keeps telling me, no, you gotta keep it up. And then he finally got to a point where he calls me, he says, you're working it too hard. I can almost guarantee you. He knows that I have the attention span of a squirrel, and he knows that the slower the fishing gets, the faster I want to go. Meaning I want to cover more water, get in front of more fish. It's just a design flaw in me, the way I approach some things. I get a little too anxious for my own good, and the finisher is not a bait that responds well to being overworked. Of all the lures out there, it's probably the pickiest about being overworked. And once I got through that, it became a serious fish catching machine. Now, what do I mean by overworking? I mean snapping the bait too hard and too aggressively upwards when you rip the bait up, or tip down when you snap it like you would have something like a jerk bait. Same thing, snapping it too hard and too aggressively, and it doesn't require that kind of force, or completely slacking it out too much. All habits I would learn by snap jigging a traditional jig of some sort, a lead head with a body on it, say a gulp minnow on a jig head, something like that. I would snap those extremely aggressively. If you work the finisher that hard, you are not going to have as good a success with it. If you smooth things out a whole bunch, you're going to find out it's going to get a whole bunch of bites. And once I made that step and started, instead of snapping it 3 feet, snapping it a foot, and doing so with half the force, tip down, just little twitches with the tip down on the jerkbait style retrieve. Even better, a lift and drop, a lower speed lift and drop when I'm working it vertical. Same kind of thing, as opposed to pure slacking it out. Because even with just a little bit of slack line, that bait moves very quickly, and that's really what it comes down to. It's very sensitive to your input, which means it's actually easy to work as long as you just concentrate on the fact that you got to go easy on it. So if you watch any of the videos on our YouTube channel, and there's some good ones on there, me working the finisher, a couple of really good trout ones especially, you'll see how subtle I'm being with it. I'm not working it very much. It looks like I'm just doing a very gentle lift and drop. But if you could see the bait underwater, you'd see how much that bait is moving around. And it's moving around a lot, to the point where it pulls the line off to the side so much that it will fool you into thinking you're bit. So that's important to keep in mind. The biggest thing is don't overwork it. And once I got it down to where I was doing more subtle lift and drops, or more subtle rod tip snaps, or whatever, particularly with the loop knot, to allow the bait to really move around on its own, it became kind of an epiphany for me, and that thing has gone on to catch them all. So I just said, what fish have I not caught? Well, anywhere that I have fished it, I've caught everything that swims. So in that particular body of water, everything from crappies and oversized bluegills, all the way up to all of the bass and walleye and white bass and wipers and everybody in between. And in my mind, being a Western angler, it's really underrated as a trout bait. When I very first got them and I was trying to figure out how to work them, it was early season. It was before bass and walleye even get going. We're talking about March in Colorado, barely any open water. Just starting to get going with it, and I was throwing it at trout. Well, the very first fish I caught on it were all trout. Well, it should tell you something. If you're a trout guy, you know it's hard to overwork a bait for trout. Trout are very excitable. They like baits that are crisp and erratic and fast and crazy. That should tell you how easy it is to overwork the bait, because once I got subtle with that, and at that time I was throwing the 7 a lot, just figuring it was the middle size, and I'd learned more by throwing that one. I started catching trout like crazy with it. And when I got it around bigger trout, they bit it like crazy too. And then when I had enough confidence in it to try to actually film a TV show with it, and the reason that's important that I have confidence in it for that, guys, is I don't put it on TV until I have confidence in it. Because by the time if I do, let's say I'm experimenting and it works that one day on film, well, now I put it out there, then you go to the store and you're like, wow, that was a good TV show. I learned something about this lure. I'm going to go get one. Well, then I wasn't correct. Well, then you're not ever going to listen to me again. And that's important to me. So by the time I'm willing to film with it and put it on TV, I have a tremendous amount of confidence in it. So when we finally did that, we did some filming in Minnesota with it and caught some walleyes and some bass. And then more specifically, I took them up to one of my favorite places in North Park and said, okay, we're going to do some damage with this thing, I suspect, even though I had never been up to that lake or anywhere near that lake with this style of lure at all, and proceeded to waylay them with it and caught some really nice fish in the mid-20s inch range, 25 type inch fish, 22 inch fish, good sized trout, and they ate the hooks off that thing. So it's a very underrated trout lure as well, and I have thrown it, just the small one. I threw the number 5 in the river here closest to me, in the Poudre River, but the flows were really low. I was working on the plunge pools, and it wasn't ideal. I did catch some fish with it, but it wasn't ideal, and so it occurred to me that bigger flows and deeper water, like maybe the Colorado River, we're probably going to do some real damage with the bait. And so we'll try that this coming year. But here we are at Christmas time, not time to be fishing the rivers for that kind of a thing. But at any rate, I'm sure it will be very, very good in that scenario as well. So a couple specific scenarios I really like. I like the tight line. I like to cast it and then close the bail, hold the rod tip in one position, and let it go down on a tight line. So the line between me and the lure is tight, the rod tip is high, and it swings down on a pendulum. And that's a fantastic way to get bites. So I'll do a lift and just hold the rod tip there until the bait swings all the way back to wherever depth I want it. At that point, I'll reel down to the bait and then lift and hold the rod right there again and let it swim back down. So it's doing a lift and drop scenario without actually plummeting down on slack line. And that's probably my most consistent one. The second most consistent one being almost a scooch, where I get it down tight to the bottom and then work it tip down and just working, say, maybe the bottom 2 feet of the water column, wherever that might be. Now, I will tell you this, the bait can be a bit snaggy. So if this is something It's not something I'm maybe going to throw around riprap if I'm going to try to tickle the bottom with. Certainly not going to throw it maybe around bushes, things like that, because it is very erratic underwater. So it will find something to snag if you give it a chance. So that's the limitation of the bait, but that's the limitation of a lot of baits. So not terribly surprising there. Not an issue though around soft vegetation, lodia grass or milfoil, whatever, because I'm getting on a heavier rod with braided line, so I can snap it out of that vegetation and rip it off there pretty easy. And keep fishing the bait. So no problems around soft vegetation, just hardwood and rock. Particularly riprap, something extremely snaggy. I've fished it over a lot of gravel and broken rock and done really, really well. I just don't fish it right on pure riprap like a dam face, something like that. If I do, I'm going to fish the open water column around it, because again, it's going to go down. If it moves around so much that it will find a crack that you don't even, by the time you realize it was there, it's there. And the bait's got good enough feel for it, or to it, that when it hits, it's an excellent bait to determine what the bottom content is. So for instance, I've been fishing it around the boat ramp. My lake is now closed to boats, so I've been fishing it around the boat ramp. I can tell you if the bait hits the boat ramp or hits the mud next to the boat ramp at the end of a long throw. And I can throw it again a long ways. I'm throwing the number 9 right now, and I can probably throw that thing 60, 70 yards. And I can still tell you if it hit the mud or hit the bottom of the boat ramp when it hits the bottom. It's a hard, dense bait, and it's going to transmit that up your braided line into your rod. So that gives you some idea of how fast the bait will dive if you give it a chance. And usually that's what I'll do. I'll let it slack out on the first drop so it goes down as straight down as possible, so that I don't lose some of my casting length. So if I make a 60-yard cast and leave the bail open, of course, attending the line, we don't ever leave an unattended bail open, ever, 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 for any reason. We are manning the line as it goes to the bottom, but we are not creating resistance. Note to self there. Let it go to the bottom and then start working the bait, and I can get my longest retrieve in my strike zone better. So that's what I'm doing with it. But at the end of the day, white bass, wipers, all the trout species, the bass, the walleyes, and crappies all love it. The crappies like it just hanging vertical, just hold it straight vertical, and then just drop it a couple inches, 3 inches. Hold the bait, hold the bait, hold the bait, hold the bait, and then drop it. And it just drops, couple 3, 4 inches, wham, they'll eat it right away. Or on that tight line drop like I was talking about. The tip down retrieve has been better for me for bass and walleyes more than anything else, or when we've been around the trout that are on a clean bottom, it works good in that regard as well. One thing I can tell you about the white bass and wipers, they don't seem to care. I can retrieve it fast, I can just straight reel it, I can snap it, any which way, and they just eat the hooks off that thing. So if you're a guy that wants to fish, schooling white bass, it's as easy as it gets. You're gonna hook a lot of them. You're going to get a ton of bites with it, and very, very, very easy to throw a long ways, so it's a great bait in that regard. So it's been one of the big surprises this year for me. I've done really well with a variety of the colors. Everyone always, what's your favorite color, what's your favorite color? Well, I'm a chrome guy, pure chrome, because I do live in the West. I fish a lot of crystal clear water. My home lake right now has probably got 12 or 15 feet of visibility in it. So chrome, pure chrome when the sun's out for me. And then I love the Ghost Morning Dawn color. There's just a whole slew of colors that are really good depending on what fish species you're after and what your watercolor looks like. So if I had to pick one overall, I think the number 9 is probably the most versatile as well. Having said that, I use all 3 sizes, and and I'm happy that I can. I have a whole box of them in the boat now, and so after a full season, which is what it takes for me to get confidence enough in a bait, after a full season of fishing them, I now carry an entire box of them in my boat, and that's saying something, because I don't carry an entire box of very many other lure genres in my boat at any given time. So that'll give you some idea how strongly I feel about it. Incidentally, I've got my camera guy hooked on him, Dan Swanson, a close friend of mine, former fishing guide, former professional walleye angler. His exact words are, it's becoming one of my favorite lures ever. So that should tell you something right there. So it's unique, it's different, fundamentally different even than a lot of other baits on the market, and it's definitely worthy of a look. So you can check them out at berkley-fishing.com. to look at the full spectrum of them there, they should not be a problem with availability at this point. So the Berkley Finisher, in my opinion, fantastic bait, super versatile, particularly if you're a Western angler fishing a variety of species of fish, something worth having. So appreciate you guys as always tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. It is a labor of love, so we hope you'll share it and subscribe and let your friends know and all of those things, because we'll continue to go on. I'm going to back up again and say, hey, if you want this thing filmed for 2025 and going forward, let me know if it's worth us making the effort to do that, and we'll do that. If you're happy with the scenario, how it is, and you're watching it while you're listening to us while you drive or whatever all the time, that's fine too. Just let us know. So join the conversation at Fishful Thinker on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, and especially the YouTube channel. And also our news channel, our new season of Fishful Thinker Television, season 29 of all the crazy things debuts here right at the end of the month and the 1st of January on Altitude Sports and World Fishing Network. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.